Hi, this is Dr. Jabali, and in this video, we're doing topic 2.2, the written answers. Topic 2.2 is all about water, so most important, it's all about the properties of water. So let's go through the questions. Here are the questions, they're all coming from previous IB exams. And when it comes to water, most of these questions are always repetitive. They're always asking about the properties of water. So here you see two questions. One is showing the outline and the other one is showing the explain, but they're both asking for the same kind of content. So for the first one, it says thermal, cohesive, and solvent properties of water. On the second one, it says explain the relationship between the properties of water, which you can see, and it's used in living organisms as a coolant, medium of metabolic reactions, and transport mediums. If you can see the translation between these two questions, you can see, for example, that the word coolant right here is basically the thermal, and the medium for metabolic reactions is usually the solvent properties, and the transportive medium here could be a cohesive or the solvent depending if it's in the blood. So that's basically asking for the same thing, but it's just put in different words. Okay, so when it comes to this, you're going to see how many other questions that comes a lot about properties of water. So here are some of the 7 things that if you put it in the paper, you're definitely going to get points somehow. One of the most important thing is talk about polar, the polarity of water, which means that water is charged. And what I mean by charged, it means that it's partially positive and partially negative, being this is on the hydrogen and this being on the oxygen. And that's such an important thing because this is what's going to allow water to be solvent and be able to do bonds with other molecules and stuff like that. And the second thing about water is about its hydrogen bond with other molecules. Now, the hydrogen bond that is happening in the water, you have to remember that hydrogen bond is just between water with another molecule, which that means if we have to draw the oxygen and the hydrogen here, first we can put the charges of the oxygen, which is minus partially negative, and the hydrogen, which is positive. Now, this basically means that if I want to connect with another water, I just have to put the dotted lines, and then we'll have the partially negative oxygen here with the hydrogen, which is partially positive, and the partially positive here. So this dotted line that I've just put it here, this is the hydrogen bond. And that's what's connecting, for example, a water molecule, such as this one right here, connecting with another water molecule. Now, this leads to 2 types of properties that we have here, which is the cohesive as well as adhesive. The only difference is the cohesive is it's a water molecule attaching to another water molecule, while adhesive is water molecule attaching to other types of molecules that are not water. So this is another properties that water has. Now, when it comes to cohesive, in this case, the cohesive, we have 2 options. You can talk about the xylem, or you can talk about the surface tension, which is actually found in the oceans. So if you remember these two, the xylem is basically where the water is going through the plants up, and surface tension, you can talk about the ocean in which the waters are holding together. That's why the boat doesn't sink. Another thing that you can talk about is it's about the thermal properties of water, such as the specific heat, the heat of vaporization, the melting point, the boiling points. All of them when it comes to water is always high. So just mention that it's high specific heat, high vaporization heat, high melting point, boiling point will get you points. You can also talk about the universal solvent, which universal solvent in this case is basically saying that water, because it's polar, it can dissolve other things that are polar. So anything that has charge, like proteins, sugar, these are all charged. Now, things that don't have charge, they are known as non-polar. In this case, would have been fat. That's why fat does not dissolve in water. But all of the other things, they actually do. So these are main things that you need to explain to whatever mark scheme that is coming. Now, here's important. Where you will find the color? Well, where you find this one, the coolant? The coolant will be found here in the explanation of the thermal. So here's where you talk about how the heat vaporization that is happening allows the body to cool off by releasing some of that heat. So when we talk about the medium metabolic reaction, we talk about how water can also be used in breaking things down, right? Such as condensation and hydrolysis. This is the making of the water and breaking the water. And we have transporting medium, which that means, like example, blood. Blood has water, and there's so many things that dissolves in blood, such as minerals and vitamins and carbohydrates and proteins. They all dissolve and they are transported. So this is just a general idea. But if you mention polarity, the hydrogen bonds, cohesive and adhesive, all the thermal properties, and universal solvents, just mentioning these and drawing, of course, two molecules of water connected with its charges, I guarantee you, you have nailed all the possible points you can get in any essay that talks about water. So let's look at the mark scheme. So you can see here, the first one says the water has a high specific heat. Just mention this, you get the points. And then here's the interesting part, because this part here shows the high specific heat, and then you have the basically the definition, which is a large amount of heat causes a small increase in temperature. So here is this usually is more for explain, because if it was outline just mention A, you get the point. But if it's explain, you definitely need to put the B. You have to give the explanation. You can't just say it's high specific heat. So giving the definition will also give the points for it. So as we were mentioning here, we have the high specific heat, we have high latent heat vaporization, and then again, because you have those, you have a large amount of heat is needed to vaporize. That's the definition for the latent heat of vaporization, and the large amount of heat causes a small increase in temperature. That specific high specific heat. So you can see these are two statements and their explanations. Now, many students get mistake between those two, because see, the specific heat is just how much heat. Now the large amount of heat can cause a small increase. That means the water can take so much heat inside of them without changing its temperature. The other one, it says how much heat can it take with him as it turns into vapor. So once again, high specific heat is how much heat can you take in without changing the temperature, while high latent heat vaporization, that means how much heat you can take with you as you turn into a water vapor, which are not the same thing. Continue with this, as I have mentioned before, the hydrogen bonds. You have to talk about hydrogen bonds and make sure it's between the water molecules, not within. And how the hydrogen bond between these molecules make them cohesive, and you can see stick together. So very important to understand the word between and within, which are not the same thing. See, between, it basically means you have a water molecule here attaching to another molecule. That's between. Within is basically the hydrogen attached to the oxygens within that molecule. So be careful when you're reading between the word between and within, because that makes a huge difference. And what I mean by the huge difference, well, if I draw the water molecule here, right, the hydrogen with the oxygens, knowing that this is partially positive and this is partially negative. When I want to draw with another molecule, let me say that there is a hydrogen partially positive attached to an oxygen that is partially negative with a hydrogen that is partially positive. You clearly see that when this hydrogen that is a positive right here is going to connect with a negative, it is a dotted line. This dotted line right here, it's a hydrogen bond. And you can see that it's between it is between this molecule and this water molecule. So this line here is a hydrogen bond, and it's not within. If it's within, it would have been a solid line. So you got to know really the difference between those two. So moving along, here we have, again, the rest of the mark scheme, where it says give water high surface tension. So what is trying to say? That cohesive properties gives high surface tension, or the water rises xylem. So these are two examples of cohesive. And this is more for the explain, so you're giving more information. Don't just say cohesive, which is a water likes another water. You're going more in details, you're giving examples. So what example of surface tension here is like, you know how there is the water in the ocean? And you know, that water is like this, which these waters are connected to each other. So the boat, for instance, it will not sink because the water has a very strong bonding with another water, and that keeps that tension together and not allowing the boat to sink. When it comes to xylem is like if you have a tree right here, let's say you have a trunk, and then you have inside that tree, there's the leaves of here, right? And what you want is the water down here in the soil to go up towards the leaf. Now it goes up towards the leaf through a little tube here. And this little tube here, we call it the xylem. So xylem is a part of the plant. Now for the water to go up this, it needs two properties. It needs the cohesive properties, which is a water molecule attached to another molecule, and it needs the adhesive properties, which is water attached to, let's say, the wall or to a window. It's attached basically to other molecules. So you need those combinations together to allow the water to go up the xylem. So you have to give an example when you're talking about cohesive. Another one is water are polar. As I mentioned, always put the polar in there. You will get points by mentioning that oxygen is oxygen is negative and hydrogen is positive. And then because of water being polar, it allows it to be good solvent. Why? Because, for example, we know that oxygen is partially negative and we know that hydrogen is partially positive. And we know, for example, salt is a solute, which is made of Na plus Cl minus. So the Na plus will go with the negative oxygen and the Cl minus will go with the positive hydrogen. That's how you split the salt, and that's how the salt dissolves. Now you can see that it has charges, which that means this molecule is polar. So anything that is polar will dissolve in water. But if it's non-polar, that means it has no charges, zero charges. And if it has zero charges, example fat will not dissolve in water. So looking along all of this, just to clear, every time they give you questions about properties of water, the main things mention about the thermal, like high specific heat, high latent heat vaporization. The next thing you do mention is the hydrogen bonds. It's very important that you mention about the hydrogen bonds and give examples such as cohesive, adhesive, right? And it can be the surface tension or the xylem. I also mentioned that the water is polar, and because of the charges, it's a good solvent. So if these words you keep it in your mind and talk about them, you get full the answers. Now, once again, between outline and explain, the outline you would have just mentioned the main ideas, right? Here. But if you want to explain, you definitely need to give the definitions in more details and giving examples. So make sure you know the difference, what to do with them. Now, if you want to go on the safe side, just write everything, even on the outline. You don't get points for saying more information. Now, here is a question that is asking about drawing the water molecules. Now, it says in different words, but it's the same thing. See, here says draw a label just like the outline here. And you're going to say outline, it must be in words. But it's just saying how hydrogen bonds form in water. And here's showing the structure of water molecules to show what? Their polarity and their hydrogen bond formation. So both are asking for the hydrogen bond. But they're basically asking for the same thing. Whenever say hydrogen bonds in water, automatically do the drawing of the water. You have the oxygen, you have the hydrogens. The hydrogens are positively charged and the oxygen negative charged because it's attracting the electrons more to them. Here you have them a solid line connecting them as a covalent. Now, if you have to do another molecule, partially negative, with the hydrogen positive, partially positive. Now, remember that when you're connecting two molecules, this partially positive hydrogen is going to connect to the partially negative. So, and then don't just draw these, make sure you label them by saying that this is a hydrogen bond. You can say that it is polar, and you can say that oxygen, okay, is negative. And you can say the hydrogen is positive. So all of these things can get you points for it, okay? So let's look at the mark scheme. In the mark scheme, it says water are polar, dipolar, or have partially positive, negative. Or you can put the symbols that I did. So just doing the drawing, you get that point, as you can see here. I did the drawing and I show these. That's enough to get those points. Next, attraction or bonding between positive and negative charge poles. So you can see here the attraction between these two. You're showing in the drawing, that gets you the points. A hydrogen bond formed between hydrogen and oxygen. And reject if hydrogen and oxygen in the same molecule. So as I was saying here, it shows that it's between two different, see, this is a molecule of water and this is a molecule of water. So I showed you right here in the middle, this was the hydrogen bond. They're saying that if you put the hydrogen bond here, the label, this label here, you're not going to get the points. What else? Then we have here the bond attraction between different water molecules, intermolecular force. Basically, it's just the drawing of two waters. So, of course, you get marks for annotating the diagram. reject the answer stated, implying that there are two whole positive negative charge. So never say in these drawings here that these charges right here should by any chances is fully positive or negative. No, they're always partially. Okay, so this is how you get your points for drawing that water. Now here we have to distinguish. When we say the word distinguish, distinguish means tell me the difference between two things. And in this case is the thermal properties of who? Water and methane. So here we have water and we have methane here. Now you cannot write this as a chart, but I'm just doing here for you to remember it. But usually you have to write in full sentences. So I would say here, for example, water is polar, while methane is non-polar. Keep that in mind. Because water is polar, water has high, everything high, while compared to methane, which is den. So say high is specific heat, then methane, right? I'll put methane here. Okay, say high boiling point, then methane, right? Melting point, then methane. So everything, because water is polar, everything, specific heat, boiling point, melting point, even the vaporization, they are all high than methane. And you have to write that full sentence to get it to point. So writing this, a high specific heat, water, right? Water has a high specific than methane, that's 1 point. Water has a high specific boiling than methane, that's a second point. And it keeps going forth. Each one of these will be a point, but you have to put them in full sentence. And most important, you have to write the word then, because that's what's coming with the word distinguish. So you can get the points, the full points you want. So let's look at the mark scheme. See, boiling point water is greater than methane. See, it's a full sentence, greater than. Also, melting point is greater than methane. Water, latent heat vaporization of water is greater than methane, or specific heat capacity of water is greater than methane. So everything is higher on the water section. Now here, this is in this mark scheme, but this necessarily means it goes with others. But here it says methane produces a good basis for comparison with water due to many similarities in their structures. They're just saying that methane can be a good structure to compare with water. What's the reason is because they have the same kind of size and weight, right? They're very close. You can see it's 16, 18, 16, which is very close. So they compare to each other. But you do not need to know about the valence structures such as tetrahedral orbital formations and water is bent while the one is a monolectus. You know, this one is definitely not necessarily, this is in this mark scheme, but it's not very common found in the mark scheme, neither is this one. So usually these are the most common ones in the mark scheme. So make sure to focus on these three. Now here it says the water has important solvent properties. So when we say solvent, automatically think of polar. It's very important. Talk about the partially positive and the partially negative sides. Okay, so here you have to illustrate, you have to explain this property using examples, right, to illustrate this answer. So here you can talk about how water, the oxygen is negative while the hydrogen is positive, right? Partially positive here, partially positive. And then you can talk about salt, which is a sodium is positive while Cl is negative, and you can just put a dotted line. Basically, this is going with that, and this one is going with this. So that means you can also talk about how water mixes with other things that are polar, which that means they have to have charges. And you can say that it does not mix with non-polar, which are no charges. And give examples such as fat. So it does not mix with fat, but it does mix with protein here because proteins have charges, so as does sugar. So this is just examples when you talk about solvent properties. And you can talk about blood. You know how blood has water, and blood is always transporting so many minerals, and these minerals have charges. So for example, blood can be transporting sugar, proteins, vitamins, minerals, all these things that have charges within them. And the reason why blood does that is because water is inside the blood. So let's look at the mark scheme. In the mark scheme, water molecule is polar, or it has a weak positive and negative charge. So like I said, polar is a big thing when it comes to solvent. Water forms hydrogen bond with polar substance. Just as I mentioned here, the bonding that I was talking, these dotted lines are the hydrogen bonds. So if you mention it, you get the points. Positive hydrogen side of the water attract to negative, and the positive side with the other ones. This is exactly what I was talking about here. The positive attracted to the negative, and the negative attracted to the positive of a salt. Glucose, other examples dissolve because it's polar. Sodium chloride examples dissolve. So it's just like I told you. So things like sugar, protein, these guys have charge. And if you mention that they have charge, they dissolve in water so they can be transported in the blood. So that's mostly the points that you can get for talking about solvents. So remember, every time you see the word solvent, think of polar, think of molecules that are polar, and think about positive and negative charge connecting with each other through hydrogen points. Now, this question here, it's talking about the hydrogen bonds and how it can exist within and between the molecules of living organisms, which we have been seeing this with the water, and see how we have impacted the structures and the functions of it. Now, it says here explained, so that means this is usually a 6 to 8 points. The importance of hydrogen bonding in living organism. Now, you notice that nothing here said water, but obviously this is very important that you mention water because water has a lot to do with binding with other things through hydrogen bond. So you can mention about the polarity, such as the partially positive and the partially negative of the water. You can talk about other molecules that are polar, that are charged, and they connect with water through this way. You can talk about, because of that, you have water going through the xylem, or you can talk surface tension. You can talk about how hydrogen bond is the reason why you have a very thermal properties, such as for example, the high specific heat or the high vaporization heat. All those high things related to water, high melting point, boiling point, how this helps water will be a coolant to the body. So what I'm talking here, if you notice, it's exactly the same answer you had about the water properties. Everything from polar to solvent to hydrogen bonds to the charges to the thermal properties, all of them repeated again. And you will see this through the mark scheme. So for example, here, the first one, cohesion, and they stick together. You can see that's due to the hydrogen bond. It's repeating the same thing. Next, cohesion helps transport under tension and the xylem. Just like I told you, it's repeating. Adhesion between water cells, again, we talk about adhesion. I told you that adhesion is any molecules attaching to something that is not like them. So for example, water attaching to a wall, and it could be the wall of the xylem. So both cohesion and adhesion here together, they push the water up through the xylem. Another one, adhesion capillary action that rise the plants. That's basically what I was just saying right now. Again, you have the tree here, and you have a tube, and you have water molecules going up through this tube. Now this tube is known as the xylem. And what makes it go up is because of the two, basic adhesion and cohesion. These two together make the capillary action. It's just like you have a cup and you put a straw in here, and you saw that the straw is filled up here. How did it fill up? Again, because of cohesion and adhesion together, they make the capillary action, which is the movement going up the straw. We also have the solvent properties, as I mentioned, the hydrogen bonds, that it's polar, hydrophilic. Now, hydrophilic here, when we say hydrophilic, we're talking about the word hydro, which means water, and the word philic, which means love. So it loves water. So anything that is hydrophilic, for sure, it is polar. So if it's polar, that means it definitely dissolves in water. So you can talk about the solvent properties of water, because water is polar. That means it allows other polars to dissolve inside. So that means other molecules that love water will dissolve with it. So because of that, it allows glucose and other things to dissolve. So glucose has charge and it can dissolve in the blood because of the water. So I also talk about late heat vaporization. This is basically saying how much heat can you get going on with you. So for example, let's say that this is the water molecule. How much heat can you put in this molecule before it turns into water vapor? Or better, how much heat inside this molecule can take as it goes as a water vapor. So every time water is coming out of you, water is taking heat with it. And that's why it keeps you cool, like by sweating. So when you're sweating, there's water coming out of it, but the water doesn't go alone. Water goes along with heat. So that means as water is leaving your body, he's dragging some of the heat out of you, and that's why you cool off. So that's because of the latent heat vaporization. So again, if you notice, this section again, it's talking about polar, it's talking about cohesion, it's talking about hydrogen bonds. It's exactly the same thing again and again and again. Then we talk about the solvent here, and again, we talk about the polar, we talk about hydrogen bonds, we talk about charges, and then we have here talking about the thermal. So it's always the same thing, the same repetitive thing. So if you can remember putting on a list the information of water and you just put it in the test, you will get the point somehow. You can see also here the heat capacity, how much water temperature is taken before, there's any changes happening, how much heat the water can take, as the temperatures goes without changing. And then the base pair between bases, nucleotide strengths. So here, now this part is not about water anymore. This is about the hydrogen bond that happens between A and T or C and G. Because this is not saying water, it's saying importance in the living organisms. So many kids think it's just water, but it's not. You do have hydrogen bonds happening in the DNA section. So it is important that you can put that too. Base pairing between RNA and DNA during transcription, right? Because if you want to build a DNA, RNA from a DNA, right, you have to have a connection of the hydrogen bonds going on between the codons and the anticodons when it comes to translation between the transfer RNA and the mRNA. So these right here, these have to do with DNA and RNA, and it's nothing to necessarily water, but it also has hydrogen bond. So proteins have hydrogen bond in a secondary structure, such as the alpha and the helix. Again, this is not anymore. These two are about DNA. And this one was actually talking about the protein. And if you remember, there was the alpha and the beta sheets. These has to do with hydrogen bonds that are going on in between the amino acids. So again, it has nothing to do with the water. They also have hydrogen bondings happening between the R groups in the tertiary structure. So again, we're going for the third structure of proteins. And habitats cause water in liquid due to high boiling point and water freezing surface. So this is just talking about, again, some plants can live in a certain level of water, for example, in freezing areas or in melting areas, depending, like bacteria goes in very high temperature areas. So certain habitats, depending on the water, certain types of living organisms going to live. So they need that kind of thing. So here, this for sure is about 8 points, if not 9 points. So if you notice, there was a section here just about water properties. And then we had a part here about DNA properties. And then we had a part here about protein structure. But all of them had in common was the hydrogen bonding. So don't limit yourself. The question never said water, but many kids think, oh, it's a hydrogen bond, that means I just talk about water. No, think of hydrogen bonds in different sections, such as the water and DNA and proteins. The hydrogen bonds are there. And of course, water habitats on water surface due to tension. That's true. For example, we have, the boat, as I mentioned, right? Surface tension. The boat will not sink because there's surface tension happened here, as the molecules are attached to each other, so they're holding on to each other very strongly. You also can have mosquitoes basically landing on the top of the water and never sinking or drowning, is because, again, the surface tension, the water are holding each other very strongly. So that means nothing can break through unless this force right here, there's a force you're pulling down. It's very stronger than the tension between the water molecules. So once again, very important that you think beyond the boxes when it comes to hydrogen bonding. Now, this question here, it says, outline how the properties of water make it ideal transport medium. So when you hear the word transport medium, we're thinking about the blood. We're thinking about transporting materials such as, for example, sugar, protein, vitamins, minerals. Now, these guys have to be polar. Why? Because only polar can dissolve in water, and we know that water is polar, and when they are both polar, what's connecting between them, it is the hydrogen bond. So you can see it's repetitive, but this time it's just talking about the solvent properties. So they're saying how the properties of water cause them to transport things. So first of all, the most important thing is saying that water is polar. Explain that. You explain by saying how oxygen is negative, partially negative, and the hydrogen is positive. and how that will connect with other things that are charged polar, such as sugar, proteins. You can even talk about the sodium NaCl plus negative, how it dissolves. And don't forget, most important, to talk about the hydrogen bonds. So if you mention these guys, you easily get points. So let's see what the mark see. See, first, polarity of water, very important. Hydrogen bonds between water molecules, that's important. Cohesion of water molecules, water stick together. So once again, cohesion, it's like you have here water, and water is bound to another water. And what's holding there is the hydrogen bond. So this is another example. Cohesion allows tension, it's aspiration pull, which means it's about the xylem. So you still can get points just by saying surface tension for cohesion. Adhesion and the cellulose. Cell wall generates tension again. Adhesion of cell walls, vessel walls cause capillary. All of this, again, is just, since it's talking about plants, we're talking about how here we have water, right, going up. If the water is going up, we also have the phloem, and in the phloem you have transport of water up and down through the mass bulk. Now this is more HR information, but again, in order to transfer water, for instance, or nutrients in plants, you do need cohesion adhesion. So whenever they say the word plants and they mention water, automatically the word water plants means xylem, and it definitely means talk about cohesion adhesion. Solvent from any substance dissolve. This is just basically saying that water is a universal solvent and is allowing many substances that are charged to dissolve in it. Liquid at most temperature experienced by plants. Basically, this is just saying that most of the plants things, the water inside the plant usually will be in liquid, it will not be frozen. Now, polarity of water, hydrogen bond can be shown in a diagram. So this is the most important thing here, is that every time they talk about properties of water, I always tell students, draw the water every single time, because every single time in the mark scheme, water structures drawing will get you points. But not just one water, make sure you're connecting the water to another molecule of water, partially negative here, hydrogen, partially positive, and make sure it's dotted line between the hydrogens. So if you keep doing this drawing, every single one that says about properties of water, you can get points easily. The last one, describe the significance of water in living organisms. This one I am basically repeating. If you notice, it's very repetitive, the questions, right? Now, it didn't say properties of water. What it said was the significance of water. So that means you're talking about all the properties. So this is just, I put this question here, even though it's so repetitive, it's just to summarize everything again. 1, talk about polarity of water. 2, talk about hydrogen bond. 3, talk about the thermal properties. 4, talk about the solvent properties. 5, talk about examples. So examples here, it can talk about the coolant, talk about the xylem, it can talk about the surface tension. And 6, draw the water molecule. All of these will, if you nail these points, you're definitely going to hit for sure the entire mark scheme. So if you see here, if you have this as an outline in your head, polarity, hydrogen bonds, thermal, solvent, examples such as coolant, xylem, surface tension, and draw the water molecule, I guarantee you, you will get the points. Now look at the mark scheme, so just to show you. So each feature part must be related to living organisms in order to receive a mark. So surface tension, as I have mentioned here, yep, I have mentioned surface tension. Talk about polarity, adhesion, cohesion, and we did. You can see we talk about polarity, and again, in the polarity, you can always talk about, again, adhesion and cohesion here, which is also part of the hydrogen bond. Continue, we talk about transparency. Now, transparency, this one used to be on the old curriculum, so this one, we do not use it anymore in the new mark scheme. Excellent solvent, as I mentioned there, capable of dissolving substance. Thermal properties, heat vaporization, excellent coolant, again, it's been mentioned. Ice floats, this one is not anymore in the new curriculum, so this is cancelled. And buoyancy is also cancelled from the organism. So basically, Ice floating, buoyancy, and transparency is not part anymore of the new curriculum, but the other ones do mention, and as you can see, surface tension, capillary adhesion, polarity, solvent, thermal properties, excellent coolants. It's repetitive. If you keep writing all these questions on water property, you will get the full points. And of course, the last one, which is structure, turbulent plant cells, hydrostatic pressure. This is more for HL students. This is just saying how you put water inside of a plant. And if you put inside the plant cell right on the vacuole and you fill it up with water, it would just keep the plant staying up. So for example, here's a plant. The plant will only stand up if there's enough water in there. But if there's no water, what happens to the plant? It would just tilt and die like that. And of course, habitat. That's the place where most organisms are living. So this is basically knowledge here, right? So what's the point of water for living organisms? Well, you need fishes, they need water to live. So water is also can be considered as a habitat for some of these species. And that's pretty much for topic 2.2. Here are some questions that they can virtually ask in the IB exams. So you can stop this video, look at these questions. You can also go to my lecture videos on water and you can answer these questions there too. Thank you.